Hello, welcome to our AFRY Management Consulting Energy webinar series. That's a mouthful to start with. So today we're going to be talking about the ETS, Emissions Trading Scheme, as you are all aware, because there are quite a lot of big changes potentially coming up, and it's quite a complex situation, I would say. So we've been busy culling material to fit in the 45 minutes. I would say that if we do run over today the 45 minutes, then of course, as usual, everything's recorded. So please excuse us if we take a little bit more time. As usual, we'll be doing Q&A and so on at the end. So let's just skip on through as I'm jumping ahead. If Alex, we could move through the disclaimer and onto the presenters. So of course, I'm Matt Brown, Vice President, Management Consulting Division, looking after the energy area, and been working in the energy environment interface for getting on nearly 30 years, not quite. So then if you could introduce yourselves, Gareth and Alex, please.
Thanks, Matt. This is Gareth Davis. I'm one of the directors with AFRY Management Consulting, based also in our Oxford office. I can't match Matt on his 30 years of experience. I can only get to 24. But my main responsibilities are for overseeing lots of our energy policy and regulation work.
And I am definitely the most junior of the bunch. Hello, everyone. I am Alex. I have been working on the interface between climate and energy policy since 2008, so that's 12 years only of seniority. And I work at AFRY a lot on decarbonization, deep decarbonization, comparative climate policy, and so on and so forth.
And I did say nearly 30, it's not quite there. Don't know, make myself sound too old. If you could pop to the next slide, Alex, then just the housekeeping. I've already said some of it, 45 minutes, but we may run over a little bit depending on how we're doing. We'll pick up questions as always, and we will do our best. If we don't answer them during the session, we'll do our best to follow up with people as much as we can. Directly with email and so on, although it may take us a little bit of time because we are a little bit rather busy on many things at the moment, but we will endeavour to do that. And the slide back and recording, of course, will be available. And don't forget the back catalogue of AFRY energy webinars, AFRY Management Consulting Energy webinars, is available on our website. And if you Google AFRY Energy webinar, you'll get there pretty easily. So with that, I think I've covered everything. I'll hand it over, I think, to Gareth to start.
Thanks, Matt. Afternoon again, everyone. It's almost a month now since European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced in her State of the Union address the plan to reduce EU greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, and that being put in place as part of a pathway to climate neutrality by 2050. And this represents quite a step change in Europe's climate ambition, with ramifications across the entire energy sector. But this is a complex challenge, as is clearly demonstrated by the 400 pages or more of the impact assessment that accompanied the announcements. And it's a lot of information therefore to take on board. And so what we wanted to do in this webinar was to start to unpack some of the main points that are there within these change proposals, and in particular a few questions that I have effectively already we want to sort of try and address. So how will the increased ambition affect emissions across the energy sector? Critically for us in this, what would be the role of the EU ETS in delivering the increased ambition? And particularly what factors will influence the decision whether to extend the scope of the ETS and how significant a change that is to the policy framework. And then obviously a final question there with, if we change the cap or the structure of the ETS, what might that mean for future carbon prices? And what better way to do that than to have alongside me Alex. As he said, he's been working on that energy climate nexus for the last 12 years or so. He's one of our carbon market experts within AFRY, and he's recently authored an AFRY white paper on the future of the EU ETS. So that's something that I would probably commend you to look at in your leisure at a later stage. So maybe, without further ado, I'll sort of pass over a bit to you. Can you tell us what really is the extent of the change that we're seeing in the targets proposed from the current ambition?
Of course, and I should say that the white paper wasn't authored by me alone. I had a co-author who was also speaking today, Gareth. Right, so without further ado, what does this mean? A bit of background. So it is important to remember that today we are at about minus 23% decarbonisation relative to 1990. And the EU's laws committed to minus 40% by 2030, and aspirationally, to reaching between 80 and 95% by the year 2050. Now, if we look at all the member states' so-called national energy and climate plans, we see from there that the laws that they have on their books would facilitate the EU as a whole reaching about minus 41% by 2030, beating the target a little bit. The impact assessment that was released a couple of weeks ago goes further and says that given laws that exist at the European level, so directives and regulations passed during 2017, 2018, the EU as a whole will get to about 45% by 2030. But unfortunately, if you continue that trajectory forward, we only arrive at around minus 60% by 2050. So this is nowhere close to the old targets for 2050, not to mention the recently proposed objective of becoming climate neutral by 2050. So this is why the Commission has last month proposed moving to minus 55% by the year 2030, thereby creating this new trajectory that will be embedded in the European climate law.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So that's quite a big change from what we were expecting. Where are the savings going to come from within the European economy?
Right. For that, I think it's worthwhile to remind ourselves of the various components that make up the European climate policy. We have several pillars going on, and the most important one, and the one that we're talking about today, is the emissions trading scheme, which in the year 2018 covered some 40% of the EU 27's emissions. However, the Commission is increasingly keen to extend this uniform carbon pricing to other sectors, which are not covered by the ETS, but instead are incorporated in the other big pillar called the effort sharing regulation. Concretely, we're talking chiefly about buildings, ground transportation, and domestic navigation, so intra-EU transportation. However, the impact assessment also talks about potentially extending it to the full non-ETS energy sector. So this would cover things like pipelines that are leaking. This would cover small generators that are not covered by the ETS. This would cover fugitive emissions from mines, tractors in agriculture, and so on and so forth. Beyond these sectors in blue, there are several other sectors left in the effort sharing regulation: agriculture and waste. This completes the whole of the ESR. These are currently not targeted for scope change of the ETS. And to wrap up the picture, we have a couple of other pillars that have so far not received that much attention comparatively. The negative emissions provided by the carbon sinks, which are our forests and our marshes. and also the international bunkers, which is a technical term for aviation and navigation that leaves the EU and goes to other jurisdictions. Now, Gareth's question was, where will all this reduction come from? And if you look at the impact assessment, it is clear that most of this is going to be delivered by the emissions trading scheme. And within the emissions trading scheme in particular, we see the power generation pulling a lot of weight. Beyond that, the other notable sector that could cut emissions is buildings. But all other sectors, such as transport, for instance, go much more sluggishly, and some sectors like intra-EU navigation and aviation navigation actually are showing an increase. So I think this might be a good moment for us to interact with our audience for the first time. Having given you this rough overview of what the sectors are and what their expected reduction potentials are, let's ask you what you think the appropriate scope of the ETS should be going forward. This is a multiple choice questionnaire, so you can click as many of these as you want. We will wait about 10-15 seconds to gather your answers, after which we'll conclude the poll. We can see that the voting share is going up. Very good. More than half of you have voted, maybe a little bit more. All right, we've broken through the 2/3 mark, so we're gonna close the poll and share the results with you. So we can see here that quite a number of you think that all transportation should be added into the ETS, less so the building sector, and then we see some tailing off. We will be presenting today mostly a combination of transportation and buildings. So we're very happy to see that you all have shown so much interest in these sectors as well. All right, let's return to the presentation.
Okay, thanks for that, Alex. I'm just confirming on your bottom slide there that actually the real change we're seeing is from in each of these sectors from the brown bar, which I think is the baseline, to the blue or the lime bar. Is
Correct.
that right?
Yes.
So that baseline represents the current ambition.
Yeah, the dark line obviously represents a historical year. The baseline projection is what the Commission assumes the world will look like once we hit 2030 and we have fulfilled all the legislation that is on the books right now. The light blue and the lime all show two potential scenarios with different ETS scopes. Under increased ambition. Both of these achieve -55%, but as we shall see, they're a little bit different in how they get there.
Okay, and obviously we've asked question a number of most of the audience seem to think that that integrating the sort of the ETS and the ESR is potentially a good idea. Maybe we might see some changing views by the end of this, or for those who are undecided, they'll have a firmer view. But what range of changes to sort of the policy framework is the Commission thinking about at the moment?
Right. So we will do a little bit of a shameless plug on the white paper that we have put out a couple of weeks ago before the Commission released its impact assessment. And in it, we saw that as we're moving into the future, there are three main questions that are affecting the emissions trading scheme. One is obviously the scope that we had the vote on. And as we will see, it can be a bit technically challenging, and it might create a little bit of unpredictability if the scope change is not thought through properly. In addition to that, we have a question on the market stability reserve, whether the way it is currently set up is at all helpful in new circumstances when we have much more ambition, but also potentially many more sectors. And finally, in the white paper, we touched upon how sustainable it might be to defend the competitiveness of European industry through free allocation in the context when allowances are becoming scarce on account of the cap diminishing. Now, the question that Gareth posed was about what the Commission thinks, and it was very interesting to see that the impact assessment only explored the first issue, meaning the scope change of the ETS, with the other two issues on the market stability reserve and on competitiveness to be addressed in future documents.
Okay, so what range of options for changing the scope have the Commission included in the impact assessment?
Right, so let's dig in a little bit deeper. We're going to review the scenarios a little bit now. I am sorry, I think I must have messed up a little bit. Yep. Apologies. Yep. Here we go. The first scenario that we're seeing is just the baseline scenario, whereby the policies that we have on the books right now are extended all the way to 2030, and we're assuming that those targets are going to be met. The emissions trading scheme does not change radically. That there is a mention of how the scope of aviation would snap back in full force to cover international flights, so from between EU and the outside world. But other than that, nothing much changes. Just the ambition increase would be increasing. Now, with increased ambition come two possible other scenarios. One is a higher ambition scenario, which is why we made the bubble green, but the scope of the ETS remains the same. This scenario essentially shows that the sectors which are currently in the ESR, so buildings and transportation, would continue to decarbonize mainly through the application of other policy instruments. So this refers to renewable energy or energy efficiency. The sectors in the middle, so navigation and international aviation, are assumed in the Commission's modeling to be part of a system that we are calling virtual allowances. This means that the Commission assumes that they would be decarbonizing under the effect of a carbon price equal to that of the ETS, but the sectors are not formally part of it. The third scenario that is relevant for us today is the carbon pricing scenario, which differs from the regulatory approaches one in one key area, which is that buildings and transportation are entirely included in the emissions trading scheme. So it is the carbon price that is solely responsible for decarbonizing these sectors.
Excellent. It looks obviously the carbon pricing option seems to be the one that the majority of the audience were thinking is the appropriate one, or their preferred one for dealing with this in the future. So what's the Commission shown there in terms of differences between these approaches?
When it comes to agreeing on what sectors can join the ETS or should stay instead in the ESR, there's likely to be several trade-offs here. main argument for including sectors into the ETS is that it becomes more economically efficient. There would be a single market with homogeneous price signal. There would be no heterogeneity from country to country, where neighboring countries might have different instruments. Different sectors are targeted by different instruments. A uniform, deep carbon market would sniff out the cheapest abatement opportunities wherever they might be, and cut emissions most effectively. Now, this is balanced by a couple of real-world inconveniences, which is that there are certain non-economic barriers which might prevent abatement from diffusing properly. For instance, the classical example is energy efficiency, and we all know how energy efficiency pays off, but nevertheless, we are not seeing it take off in various sectors, industrial, residential, and so on and so forth, due to split incentives, poor financing, lack of information, lack of manpower. These are issues that carbon pricing on its own is not necessarily best equipped to address. Another question is regulatory efficiency. So if we were to include buildings and cars, I don't think anybody seriously thinks that when you go and fill up your car for however long they will still be running on petrol, that you would be buying an EUA. Or likewise, if you are trying to heat your home with methane, that you're going to be buying allowances. Instead, the point of regulation is most likely going to be wholesale distributors of these fuels. But then the question remains of how these new entities would interact with other ones. Most importantly, entities that are already in the ETS. The classical example being, for instance, if a company sells gas to residential consumers, but it also sells gas to a power plant, that gas, on account of the scope change, will have been paying the carbon price. So what about the power plant? Does its emissions have to pay the carbon price again, even though it's been paid by the wholesale distributor? These are questions that would have to be answered when expanding the scope. Now, it's not all negative though, because problems often find solutions, and we have seen examples of jurisdictions where transport and buildings have been integrated into an emissions trading scheme. And you have California there in the picture, but also in New Zealand and Quebec, the equivalent exists. And we certainly have seen in the 400-page document that the Commission has released that Europe has done its own thinking. One approach would be to keep the sectors both in the ETS and in the ESR, with the rationale being that this would incentivize member states to address some of the non-economic barriers that carbon pricing cannot solve. And another approach would be to create a parallel ETS just for these sectors, giving regulators time to iron out the problems, and then eventually merge the two into one, not in one step, but in two.
Thanks, Alice. There's quite a few trade-offs that still need to be made if we're to consider what may happen on the scope change. The aspect about sort of the non-economic barriers. I suppose one question might be, if those are large, then do you risk distorting an ETS if you put those sectors within the scope for an ETS, or might the ETS itself be seen as a sort of catalyst for removing those or addressing those barriers?
Indeed, that's a valid question. But the obverse for it is that are European consumers and governments voted for by these consumers willing to put up with the really high carbon prices that would crush through these non-economic barriers? So it's indeed a very careful political calculus that has to be made of whether we are going to expand or not.
Okay, and how big a difference is there in these carbon prices according to the Commission?
Right. So let's explore the scenarios a little bit. Again, we have in brown the baseline scenario, and in blue and green we have the two main scenarios, with and without scope change, with scope change in green. And I think the most important things are on either side of the graph. You can see that the both scenarios with added ambition achieve the same greenhouse gas cuts by the year 2030. But what really sticks out is the difference in the carbon price. And this is what I was mentioning before, that if you include buildings and transportation, which have much higher abatement costs than, for instance, the power sector, you might have to put up with carbon prices that are roughly twice as big as the ones otherwise without the scope change.
That's interesting. So if I look at that, the Commission's projection is that the regulated scenario with quite a significant increase in ambition doesn't vary much at all in terms of the carbon price from what would happen with the current ambition.
We're of course not quite aware of what the Commission modelers had in mind when they were designing these scenarios. So, for instance, if they imposed the carbon price in the regulatory scenario to be equal to the baseline price, and then allowed just the carbon price scenario to float freely. But we have investigated this on our own, and I think this is something that we should ask maybe from our audience what they think is an appropriate way of going about this. So we're going to have a second poll to ask of you whether you think that a high carbon price is better than a mix of other policies. Obviously, we're not asking you why, but let's see what you think. Okay, we've passed the halfway mark. A couple more people to get to 2/3 coverage. But I think the numbers have stabilized. Let's share the results. Interestingly, I enjoyed the benefit of seeing the answer stream in immediately, and the first answer that we got were very heavily skewed towards the yes side, and then no gained market share or pace. But this is not quite like the Brexit vote, but still it seems that a majority, an actual majority, think that high carbon price is something that we as Europeans could put up with. Now, it remains to be seen in a more careful analysis if this is because most of the people on the call are from the power sector and they would need a higher carbon price, or otherwise. But let's move on. Thank you very much for your participation.
Okay, so it's probably worth moving through to the next slide. So I suppose we've looked at, I think, Alex, at what the Commission has said may happen, and actually there's quite a wide variation in what they think may happen depending on whether or not you increase the scope of the ETS. I mean, is it just the case that the carbon prices are likely to increase only if you increase the scope of the ETS?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We did try to investigate this, also using our modeling capabilities, and we have found plenty of confirmation actually that the change in ambition is enough to drive up the carbon price. And we've uncovered some intriguing possibilities over the long term as well. So let's look into that maybe step by step. First of all, we know from past ambition revisions that the EU tends to push the ETS sectors harder than all the other ones. This chart, maybe it's an unusual way for people to look at this question, but it shows on the horizontal axis the economy-wide decarbonization. So for instance, for 2030, we're trying to hit 40%. On the vertical axis, instead we're showing the ETS decarbonization. So what you're seeing there are in black the 2020 target and the 2030 target, and then the modeling done way back when on the 2050 target as well. And now we're going to add some new data points. On the bottom left, we are seeing the modeling done in 2018 around the possibility for the EU to achieve climate neutrality around 2050. And the big marker that you're seeing towards the center is the least controversial proposal that we have from the Commission for the year 2030 from this September. And the values there, minus 53% and minus 63%, bear some thought. Minus 53%, the first value, is the economy-wide decarbonization. It is not minus 55 because some percentage points of decarbonization are, in the Commission's view, delivered by the carbon sinks that Europe has. Minus 63%, this is relative to 2005, is the decarbonization that the ETS has to deliver. And what is interesting is if you look at things against this red diagonal, and the simple interpretation of this red diagonal is that the further away from it you are towards the bottom right, the harder you're pushing the ETS relative to everything else. And as you can see, this is pretty much the strongest veer towards the bottom right that we have seen ever. So indeed, the idea that the Commission has is that the ETS ought to be pushed harder than ever before. Now, we have reason to believe that this minus 63% relative to 2005 is not necessarily the upper boundary to where the ETS might go. And this is because of what is happening in the ESR. There are several poorer Eastern European member states who have very much less challenging decarbonization targets in the ESR than wealthier Western European countries, and they are disinclined to accelerate their decarbonization, and therefore have been vocal about maybe wanting the ETS to decarbonize even harder than what is being proposed. So this is a reason to think that the 63% is, if anything, a lower bound for how much the ETS might have to decarbonize in the future.
And Alex,
so,
just to add on that, one other point that is these aren't necessarily all very small countries either in terms of their overall emissions, and so it's not like the ESR could increase its contribution as a whole, but with the wealthier Western European countries, as you put them, shouldering a higher burden without changing anything for the non-supporting countries.
Indeed, and even the current targets for the wealthy countries are so strenuous that they have insisted to be able to utilize EUAs from the ETS against their ESR obligations, because this is so difficult. So squaring this circle is going to be tricky, and it may come at the expense of compliance entities under the ETS. So we're getting to the fun part. I think very many people are looking forward to this to see roughly where the prices are heading. And we will do this a little bit differently. Rather than us telling you where we see the prices heading, we would like to ask you where you think the prices might go to under these circumstances. Now, the parameters of the questions are that we're asking you about how much the price will increase relative to today by the year 2030 if the scope of the ETS stays as is. We can see a battle brewing, yes. Half of you have voted. But I'm not seeing much of a trend changing here. So I'm going to close the poll and reveal to you that most of you think the prices are going to rise by anywhere between 25 and 50 euros relative to today. And some of you are a tad bit less bullish. But there's very few of you who think the prices will stay within 10 euros of today or go beyond 80. Very well, thank you. Let's show you now our results. So we have an in-house model called Ether, which models the EU ETS, and its results are part of our quarterly output that we send to our clients. And we have done something called a first order analysis, where we have taken the capacity mix of power plants in the EU that we have forecast for the most recent quarter, and have simply imposed on it the higher ambition levels, several of them. And here are the results. The dark line at the very bottom represents the prices which we have forecast in our central scenario during Q3 of this year. And each band of color represents a 5 percentage point increase in ambition in the year 2030. I should say that the central scenario does not aim at climate neutrality in the year 2050, and the ambition level that we are assuming in central is only 45% decarbonization, so a smidgen above what the policy says today. And just to summarize it, basically for each 5th percentage point of added ambition, we see a gain of roughly 10 euros on the carbon price. So congratulations to those of you who went with 50. We certainly feel very happy to have our view validated by the marketplace. And let's see how this evolves under more complicated circumstances.
Okay, so thanks. That's just looking at just changing the cap itself, but I suppose some of the change looking at about the trajectory of the cap obviously will affect the dynamic of that profile on prices. So how might we see that change in the future?
Yeah, so the trajectory is actually a bit of a doozy indeed. We see several possibilities here. So this is the cap all the way to 2030. You can see it change a little bit in the year 2020 to 2021. And the things that we have done in Ether in order to obtain the results on the previous slide was to take the Commission's guidance and say from the year 2026 onwards, for 5 years on, we are going to trend all the way to the target in 2030. However, there are some complications that need to be considered here. One is that there are several ways that EUAs can be used other than for compliance. As I mentioned before, there are several wealthy member states who can utilize EUAs to offset ESR emissions, and the Commission has been very open about how this flexibility may need to be increased in order to deal with tougher ESR targets. So this would mean that 100 million that can be extracted during phase 4 might go up, and by how much we simply don't know at this point. Phase outs, coal phase outs, have often been discussed in the context of EUA cancellations in order to prevent this unilateral action by a member state from causing problems in the carbon market. So far, only Germany has said that they would do this, but other member states could theoretically follow as well. The final thing, though, that is interesting is that the Commission has proposed a very eye-catching provision to rebase the cap. The argument for that being that emissions have been trailing below the cap for a very long time, and I guess it is not stated explicitly, but with the market stability reserve, which has been propping up carbon prices in these circumstances of oversupply over the recent years, as that market stability reserve becomes weaker over the future, then some other means of restoring the investment guiding function of the ETS might be necessary, and this is the cap rebasing that we're seeing here. And this is basically not something that the Commission has really committed itself to exploring in the impact assessment on account of the MSR review being slated by law for the following year and likely forming part of the package that would be released in June. But we're seeing 3 rough possibilities here to deal with this question. One is that the MSR would need to be adapted. For instance, we now enjoy a doubled intake rate of the MSR relative to what it was designed to do, and that expires. We have some thresholds for when the MSR reduces the market surplus and when it adds back to it, but there's a question of those thresholds are still appropriate given changing circumstances. So all of these things will have to be balanced in the MSR review. And I think at its most fundamental, we need to be mindful of the fact that the MSR was a measure introduced in a time when the market was vastly oversupplied. And when we're moving to this much higher ambition level of minus 55% economy-wide, one wonders whether what it was designed for is still a problem in the future. The second approach is to have this rebase cap that we presented before. It is meant to bring back the decarbonisation impetus onto sectors such as industry and so on. And lowering the cap would be, one might say, the appropriate measure to take when given the fact that the original cap was set at demonstrably way too high levels in the past. But there's some problems with this. The Commission's approach, for instance, to backloading has in the past been characterized as interventionist and not allowing the market to work. And the Commission doesn't really explore that much in depth how much the cap should be reduced by in a step change. It only has a throwaway comment about 250 million allowances, the cap being higher than emissions by 250 million allowances in 2019. So we don't know what value would be applied in 2026 or how to come up with it. And also we note that the jolt to supply all comes in one go. and that might be sudden for certain market participants. So the third option is something that we have developed by looking at other jurisdictions where we have a presence, which is the northeastern US, where a different carbon market, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, is in place. And what we have seen there is that the authorities do have a base cap from which they don't stray. They only enhance its ambition for future decades. But they have been very willing to implement so-called interim adjustments, reducing the volume allowances allowed onto market by a volume equal to the full amount of allowances banked in previous phases. These interventions have been quite forceful, as you can see. The first two interventions that we have seen in RGGI between 2014 and 2020 amounted to 24% of the base cap gone, issued but never supplied to market. And the RGGI has already committed to a third interim adjustment, which would be implemented over the course of the following decade, which would also remove some 15% allowances. The advantages of this relative to rebasing is that the change is not ad hoc. We know what is going to be targeted, the full extent of the surplus accumulated, and also the withdrawal is gradual. So it is much gentler on all market participants. So for the medium term, this might be a better way to do it, but we would be keen to see if this idea is picked up by market participants in Europe. Now, this was the medium term. And I would like now to go to the long term, to 2050. And again, we're looking here at the cap as it stands today. No sunset clause for the LRF, meaning we are trending it in a straight line all the way until it hits zero, and then we can have interesting discussions of what happens thereafter. But let's plot against that now the two caps that we have found in the Commission's proposal. The simple trend towards 2030, and then some assumed cut in the cap through rebasing, and then again the trend towards 2030. And the question is, okay, I mean, assets have a lifetime longer than 10 years, and they need to look at what's happening past 2030. So what's the appropriate cap to be drawn thereafter? And well, one way to do it is to say that this is being done in the context of climate neutrality being a thing. And if you look at the impact assessment from 2018 about how to achieve neutrality, we see that we need to be at minus 50 megatons in the ETS at the present scope in the year 2050. So that gives you a point, and then you just unite 2030 to 2050. And we have lost 7 years of positive cap. So that's one possibility. On the other hand, just as the cap has been drawn for the current cap without any sunset clause, you could extend the trends for the cap revision for 2030. And all of a sudden, you find yourself in a world where the ETS cap becomes zero well before 2040. And that, I think, is an eye-catching mathematical fact that is sure to get people to express all sorts of opinions. So we would like to test.
Alex, I'm thinking about partly in terms of time. But also obviously what we're seeing here is, you know, there's lots of uncertainty over where the trajectory is going within, or could go within the current ETS. So that creates a lot of uncertainty for current market participants. It'd be interesting, given in the limited time we've got left, maybe to say what happens when we change the scope? What
Very
are
well.
what additional levels of uncertainty does that bring in?
Very well. So the change of scope also poses some interesting questions. When you change the scope, you alter both the supply and the demand of the carbon market, and it is maybe worthwhile to look at what has been done in the past. So we have had scope change in the ETS in the year 2013, where new stationary sectors have been added. You can see their historical activity level represented in an abstract fashion, against which allowances were issued. And the takeaway message is that the volume of allowances issued was declining in what we call a tapered fashion. But this is not necessarily the only possibility. When aviation was added for phase 3, the profile was a flat one. So it is an open question of what kind of cap regulators might want to issue against these potentially very sensitive sectors. So if we explore that a little bit, we can look at a couple of things. We have a projection for the emission levels of the transportation and buildings all the way to 2030, and we have assumed a likely reference point for grandfathering allowances against, as well as the endpoint suggested by the Commission for the year 2030 under a minus 55% decarbonisation target. So out of these things, how do we create a cap? We could do the same thing as in aviation, to say take 95% of the grandfather level and then issue it in a flat manner. Alternatively, we implement a tapered cap, and working backwards from the endpoint, we are trying to aim for the grandfather level. So on the flat one is the equivalent of the aviation experiment, and the tapered one is the equivalent of the new stationary sectors. Now, these things have remarkably different impacts on the supply-demand balance in the ETS. A flat cap will give you will add length to the market, depressing the carbon price, whereas the tapered cap will turn the market short. And obviously, you can design, for instance, a different kind of flat cap, for instance, where the net effect on the market is neutral. But you run into all sorts of complications here as well, which is that you don't end up in 2030 where you wanted to end up. So it is genuinely a puzzle that policymakers are going to have to work over to see what the appropriate level of not level, but profile the cap for these new sectors ought to have. And this is just for them and in the medium run. So what happens if in the long run for the entire market? And as reference points, we are presenting again the conventional ETS cap all the way to 2057, and then the relaxed regulatory cap without scope change that we talked about before. And the resulting cap for everything takes a little bit of getting used to. This is what we have obtained, and let's explain one by one what is happening here. We are imposing on top of the stationary cap a starting point, and the starting point is the starting point of the tapered cap from the previous slide. That's the first point. The second point is where the Commission says that a fully scope changed ETS needs to get to by the year 2030. And finally, all these sectors by 2050, we're looking at where they would be according to the impact assessment from 2 years ago, which is still slightly positive in the year 2050. That gives us a third point, and we unite everything with a line and trend to zero. And it is very difficult at this point to say what would happen to carbon prices, and we frankly have not done this exercise at this point because it's just too complex. But we are looking forward to exploring this some more in the future, in future modeling.
So Alex, I think actually, I mean, that's a sort of a monumental effort in getting through as much as you have of what's in the sort of the impact assessments in that time frame. I mean, a couple of things that I take away from the discussions we've had reading through the document are that actually there's still plenty of detail that needs to be explored. So, you know, the change in the ambition and the way in which the Commission is looking at, you know, is opening up the whole of the policy framework to possible reform, regardless of any change in scope. You know, a 55% decarbonisation target by 2030 is going to put extra pressure on the current ETS sectors, and there is, for me, still a sort of a question around the sort of validity of expanding the scope, and it'll depend on the practicality of adding the sectors, as well as their ability to respond to the price signals in there and overcome some of those non-economic barriers. I suppose there's a flip side which says actually a wider ETS may encourage sort of sharper innovation and reductions in technology and abatement costs, and we may see some additional benefits there. But also it basically is just that there's a massive lack of clarity around lots of what is going to happen in the future cap trajectories, and therefore the sort of the price outcomes there. So my last question to you, Alex, is what's the timeline from here?
Right. Well, that's thankfully a lot less complicated than all of these options. There's two pieces of legislation that are relevant here. One is the European climate law itself. We have, with this impact assessment and the speech by Ursula von der Leyen, we have seen that the Commission has laid out its claim, minus 55% using sinks by the year 2030. The European Parliament also voted a much more ambitious position last week, 60%, and without the use of sinks. So these are several percentage points tougher than the Commission's proposal. And then the European Council, we're still waiting for them to iron out the differences, mainly with Poland. Hopefully this will conclude by December of 2020. But this would mean that within the first half of next year, we will see probably legally binding targets for Europe for 2030 and 2050. The important thing for carbon market participants is what happens with the ETS revision. And that hasn't even hit proposal stage. That is presumably being worked over by the Commission as we speak, along with the MSR revision. And the proposal is likely to see the light of day during June 2021. And as I said, there would be MSR in there, there will be border adjustments in there, and this is more than likely to take at least the 3 years that the previous ETS revision has taken. And we expect publication in the official journal of the European Union based on the timeline of last time around to happen around February 2025, which should give traders the moment when they have legal text, black and white, that they can point to in order to start taking new positions and change the prices in the carbon market.
Thank you, Alex. I think that largely brings us to the end of the presentation. And Matt, you were probably very prescient to predict it overrunning the 45 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. So So I'll just, unless Gareth, there's anything further we wish to say, maybe given we're at the top of the hour, the full pack will be available for people and will be emailed out after we've finished the webinar today, probably over the coming days. So please do get in touch if you want to talk more about this very fascinating area, high degree of uncertainty, and of course crucial in terms of the work we're doing as well, looking at carbon prices as one of the key drivers of commodity, other electricity prices, and also decarbonisation routes. Gareth, anything further, or shall we close there?
I don't think there's anything further for me. I'd just like to sort of, again, thank everyone for taking the time to attend, and for so many of you staying on for the whole session. And also, particular thank you to Alex for leading us through these things.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks, and to those putting on the webinars as well, Johnny and Mai, thank you. Also, a lot of hard work goes into making this all happen. So look forward to talking to you next time when we'll be looking at operational efficiency and digitalization in the energy sector with some of my AFRY colleagues. Bye-bye.